Why would a teacher humiliate a student just for standing up? And why did a 13-year-old black boy freeze the entire classroom by solving something that wasn't supposed to be solvable at his age? It was 9:14 a.m. when Malik Johnson rushed into room 2C of Ridgefield Middle School. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and his school bag clung to him like a shield. He was late again. All eyes turned toward him as the door creaked open, but it wasn't the students he feared. It was the voice that followed. "Late again, Malik," came the cutting tone of Mrs. Trudy Callahan. She didn't look up from her clipboard as she underlined something with unnecessary aggression. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her expression was tighter. "Take your seat, now." Malik didn't move. He stood frozen by the door, eyes darting toward the only empty seat in the front row, the one directly under the humming fluorescent bulb that had been flickering all week. But still he remained upright, his hand gripping the strap of his backpack like it was the only thing keeping him steady. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Callahan," he said quietly, almost too quietly. Can I stand today?" For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock. Then came a soft exhale of disbelief. The teacher's pen froze. Her eyes slowly rose to meet his. "You'd rather stand?" she echoed, loud enough for the class to hear. "What do we do now? Make our own rules." She stood slowly, as if addressing an open rebellion. "Do you think you're special, Malik?" He opened his mouth but hesitated. His voice trembled as he spoke. "It's just that, my back. It still hurts from—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. She knew. Everyone knew. But instead of understanding, she narrowed her eyes and jabbed a finger toward the seat. "Sit down." "I can't," Malik whispered. A silence fell over the room, heavier than any lecture. Then with a slow, sinister smile, she turned back toward the whiteboard and erased the simple algebra problem written there. In its place, she scribbled an intimidating mix of calculus symbols, curves, integrals, and equations no one in that classroom had ever seen before. "If you won't sit, then let's see what makes you so different. This," she said, capping the marker with flair, "is a problem from my 11th grade advanced placement class. Since you think you're above following instructions, you can solve this. You have 5 minutes, or it's a week in detention." There was a sharp intake of breath from the class. Laughter followed. Zeke, the class clown, made exaggerated gasping noises. "Better get that genius brain working, Malik," he muttered, prompting more chuckles. And here's where I pause just for a second. Not in the story, but in reflection. Because I've seen this play out before. Teachers like Callahan don't just teach, they dominate. And students like Malik, they survive. They tiptoe. And sometimes they shine, not because of their environment, but in spite of it. Malik looked at the board. His heart raced, but somewhere beneath the anxiety was a flicker of something deeper. Recognition. The problem wasn't foreign, it was familiar. Because while his classmates played games or scrolled through videos each night, Malik had been sitting at the dusty back corner of the Ridgefield Public Library, devouring pages most college freshmen would struggle with. Mrs. Dorsey, the librarian, had noticed him months ago. "Back again, huh?" she'd say each time he walked in, making her way to the mathematics section before he could even ask. He never told her exactly why he was there, but she knew. That boy was hungry. For knowledge, for understanding, for a space where he wasn't being punished for being different. It had started the year before, when his father was fixing a broken sink. Malik had watched him measure twice before cutting once. "Math is the only truth in the world," his father had said. "People lie, emotions change, but 2 plus 2, that's always 4. That single line had stayed with Malik, etched into his memory like a formula he'd never forget. At home, Malik shared a room with his little sister. Their mom worked double shifts at the hospital, and their dad picked up whatever construction jobs he could find. Malik didn't have a computer. He didn't have a tutor. But he had a phone with a cracked screen and a lot of determination. Every night, under the blanket with the screen dim low so as not to wake his sister, he'd study calculus videos and forms. He scribbled notes in a composition book so full the binding had started to fray. He learned derivatives like they were lyrics, He whispered integrals to himself like prayers. But no one at school knew, not until now. He stepped forward. His classmates still laughed behind him, but their voices began to fade as Malik lifted the marker. He stared at the board, his eyes flicking across the equations. He adjusted his grip, rolled his shoulders, and began. The room went still. The ticking clock returned as the dominant sound. One symbol after another appeared on the board. Substitution, chain rule, derivative simplification. Malik didn't scribble. He didn't guess. He wrote with intention, each line building upon the last, his logic flowing like a symphony of numbers. Callahan's smile faltered. Arms crossed, she watched, eyes narrowing. Zeke muttered, "Wait, what's he doing?" Another student whispered, "Is that right?" By the time Malik reached the final step, the room was dead quiet. No one was laughing now. Even the ceiling lights stopped buzzing, as if the universe itself had paused to witness what was happening. He underlined the final answer and stepped back, marker still in hand, heart pounding but face calm. Mrs. Callahan rose from her seat. She walked to the board, scanned the work, then stared harder. Her face twisted into something ugly, confusion, maybe even fear. This is, she stammered, then stopped herself. "Where did you copy this from, Malik?" she asked, voice now sharp and accusatory. "I didn't copy it," Malik said softly. "I solved it." "You memorized it. You must have found this online. This is a setup." "It's not. You're barely passing pre-algebra. There's no way." "But I did." Her voice rose again. "Enough. I won't tolerate this dishonesty. Detention, principal's office, now." She grabbed the marker, scribbled over his equations like a tantrum, then tore the scratch paper from his hand and crumpled it, tossing it into the trash. No one spoke. No one laughed. Even Zeke, who usually had something to say, stayed silent. And then from the back came a small voice. "But what if he really solved it?" Everyone turned. It was Aisha Reynolds, the shy girl who almost never spoke. Callahan whipped around. "Not another word." Malik turned to the door. The hallway stretched before him, and the hard wooden bench outside the principal's office felt 1,000 miles away. But he walked, back straight, chin high, even though his back burned with every step. Because for the first time, he wasn't just walking out of a classroom. He was walking toward the truth. Malik sat on the cold wooden bench outside Principal Jacobs' office, his backpack still clutched tightly to his chest like armor. The ticking clock on the wall above him marked each second with the precision of a metronome, reminding him that time was still moving, even though everything inside him felt stuck. He tried not to wince every time he shifted, but the ache in his lower back flared like a warning flare. Proof of last week's ruler across his spine. And now, even though he had just done something remarkable, he was being punished like a criminal. Again. Behind the frosted glass door, he could hear voices. One sharp and familiar. Mrs. Callahan's, rising and falling with performative outrage. The other deeper, calmer, Principal Jacobs, asking measured questions in that same tired voice he always used when teachers brought him problems they didn't want to solve themselves. "He refused to follow instructions," Callahan barked, her shadow gesturing wildly behind the glass. "He disrupted my classroom and then produced a solution to a problem far beyond his level. It's clearly memorized, or worse, cheated." "And you're certain?" Jacobs asked, though the exhaustion in his voice hinted that he already knew what answer would come. "Absolutely," she snapped. "He's a C- student in my class. There is no logical explanation for what happened." No logical explanation. Malik let those words sink in, and for a moment they made something inside him wilt. It didn't matter how many nights he spent buried in textbooks, or how many equations he solved alone under the flickering light of his old desk lamp. In this building, logic didn't mean facts. Logic meant perception, status, authority. And Malik had none of that. The door opened suddenly, making Malik jolt. Principal Jacob stood in the doorway. He was tall, older, with temples gone gray and shoulders that carried the weight of a system built more for control than understanding. "Come in," he said flatly. Malik entered, keeping his back straight despite the pain. Callahan was already seated, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly they looked like they'd been drawn with a ruler. Jacobs gestured to the chair opposite her and placed a small pillow on it. Malik hesitated. "It's okay," Jacobs said, almost softly. "I was told you've been dealing with some discomfort." Malik sat slowly, surprised by the gesture. This wasn't how these meetings usually started. "Mrs. Callahan tells me you refused to sit during class, then caused a disruption when challenged. She also says you presented a solution to an advanced calculus problem. Is that true?" "Yes, sir," Malik said quietly. "She believes you cheated." "I didn't cheat," Malik replied. "I've been studying calculus on my own. At the library." Online Callahan scoffed, cutting in before Jacobs could reply. "He's lying. If he was capable of this kind of work, I would have seen it in class. But he doesn't participate. He doesn't submit homework consistently. He barely speaks." Malik looked at her. "Because I'm afraid of you." The silence that followed was thick. Callahan's mouth twitched as if she'd just tasted something bitter. Jacobs leaned forward. "Malik, why were you really standing in class?" Malik hesitated. He glanced toward Callahan. Her gaze was fixed on him like a warning. He wanted to tell the truth. God, how he wanted to tell the truth. But the memory of the ruler cracking against his back echoed through his bones. "I fell," he said weakly, "over the weekend." Callahan sat back, arms tightening. "He's lying," she said smoothly. "This is an elaborate excuse to justify his behavior. He refused to sit. He disrupted the class. Then he pulled this calculus stunt, thinking it would impress people." Jacobs was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached for a detention slip. 2 days detention, he said finally, almost regretfully, for insubordination and classroom disruption. Malik's heart sank. He wanted to scream. He wanted to shout that the only reason he was even standing was because of her. But what good would it do? No one ever believed him. Not really. He reached out to take the slip from Jacobs's hand, and that's when the door opened again. "I'm sorry to interrupt," said a voice, bright and firm. It was Ms. Diana Carter, the science teacher. Younger than most of the staff, always wearing big glasses and a bigger smile, she stepped into the room with her usual bounce. But today, her eyes were serious. "I heard Malik was in here. Is everything okay?" "Nothing that concerns the science department," Callahan said dismissively. Ms. Carter ignored her. "It does concern me. He's one of my best students." There was a pause. Even Jacobs looked up at that. "Best student?" Callahan repeated, eyebrows raised in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I am," Ms. Carter said. She turned to Jacobs. "What is he being punished for?" Jacobs cleared his throat. "Mrs. Callahan says Malik attempted to solve a calculus problem during class. She suspects cheating." Ms. Carter blinked. "Wait, calculus? As in actual calculus?" "Yes," Malik said. "It wasn't that hard. Just substitution and—" "She fed him the answer, clearly," Callahan snapped. "There's no way he could solve that problem on his own." Ms. Carter crossed her arms. "You remember his science fair project from last spring? The mathematical modeling of plant growth? He used differential equations that weren't even in our curriculum. That project won 3rd place at the state level and 1st in mathematics." Jacobs raised an eyebrow. "You never told me about this." "He asked me not to. Said he didn't want the attention." Jacobs looked back at Malik. "Is this true?" Malik nodded slowly. "He's been doing independent math work for months," Carter added. "Advanced work. College level, in some cases." Callahan scoffed again, but the confidence in her voice had started to waver. Jacobs leaned back in his chair. "Then perhaps we should give Malik a chance to prove it." Malik looked up, startled. "How?" "A supervised test," Jacobs said. "Something fair. Prepared ahead of time. We'll see what you can really do." "I can do that," Malik said, his voice steady now. Callahan jumped in. "I'll prepare the test myself." "Actually," Ms. Carter interjected, "to avoid any perception of bias, I think the test should be reviewed by the principal before being administered." "Are you accusing me of being unfair?" Callahan bristled. "I'm saying that this should be about Malik, not about pride," Carter replied. Jacobs held up a hand. "Enough. Ms. Callahan, you'll prepare the test. I'll review it. Malik, you'll take it tomorrow morning. If you can demonstrate what you claim, then we'll revisit this conversation. Malik nodded, though his stomach was a knot of nerves. As he left the room with Ms. Carter by his side, he felt a strange calmness settle over him. Tomorrow he would finally have the chance to show them, not because he needed to prove himself to Callahan, but because he was tired of hiding. Behind them, Callahan's voice rose in protest again, but this time it didn't sound like confidence. It sounded like fear. And Malik? For the first time since walking into that classroom, he wasn't afraid anymore. The next morning, Malik arrived at school early, earlier than he had ever arrived in his life. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and the halls of Ridgefield Middle were unusually quiet. He stood outside the conference room alone for a few minutes, his hands sweaty despite the crisp air. When Miss Carter appeared down the hall with her usual bright smile and a small packet of mechanical pencils in hand, he felt the tightness in his chest ease just a little. "I figured you might need these," she said, placing the pencils gently on the table inside the room. "No distractions, just you, the problems, and your mind." He nodded, grateful but still anxious. "What if I freeze?" "You won't," she said with certainty. "You've been solving problems harder than these in your sleep." At exactly 8 a.m., Principal Jacobs entered, a sealed envelope in hand and a manila folder under his arm. Mrs. Callahan followed behind him, her lips pressed together so tightly they looked like they might vanish into her face. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her expression said it all. She still didn't believe he belonged here. Jacobs placed the test in front of Malik, gave him a nod of encouragement, and said, "You have 2 hours. Begin when you're ready. I'll stay in the room to monitor. Ms. Callahan and Ms. Carter will wait outside." As the door shut behind them, Malik took a breath and turned the first page. It was insultingly easy. Basic algebra and linear equations. He finished them in less than 3 minutes. The second page moved into geometry and functions, the third into trigonometry and polynomials. He solved each problem with calm focus, checking his work not because he doubted it, but because he wanted perfection. By the time he reached the final section, calculus, the real test began. These weren't beginner problems. These were multi-step integrals, substitution scenarios, and complex limit challenges. But they didn't scare him. They were familiar. They felt like home. The language of logic he had taught himself in stolen hours and dim corners of the public library flowed from his pencil with clarity and rhythm. Outside the room, Mrs. Callahan paced. Ms. Carter watched quietly, flipping pages in a journal she wasn't really reading. Finally, Callahan spoke. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "He's probably stuck on the second page, doodling." Ms. Carter glanced up, her voice cool. "What exactly about his success threatens you so much?" Callahan stopped pacing, her mouth twisting. "It doesn't threaten me. It insults the work I've done my entire career. So it's about you." "No," Callahan said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's about standards. It's about discipline." "No," Ms. Carter repeated, this time more firmly. "It's about a child who did something extraordinary, and instead of lifting him up, you tried to crush him." Before Callahan could respond, the door opened. Principal Jacobs stepped out with an unreadable expression. "He's asking for more paper," he said simply. Callahan blinked. "What?" "He's finished the entire exam, and he's now writing alternative solutions for some of the calculus problems." For a brief second, Callahan's composure cracked. "That's impossible." Jacobs raised an eyebrow. "Nevertheless, it's happening." He returned to the room, leaving behind a silence thick with disbelief. Malik continued writing for another 30 minutes. He included notes on each problem, explaining his methods, comparing multiple approaches, derivative-based, graphical interpretations, even numerical estimations for more complex functions. By the time he put his pencil down, the sun had risen fully through the blinds, and the quiet hum of the school day pulsed through the hall. When the final bell for second period rang, Principal Jacobs collected the test. He didn't say much, just a quiet nod and a thank you. Malik stood slowly, his back still sore, but his posture more upright than ever. The work was done. Now the truth had to speak for itself. By lunchtime, whispers were everywhere. Did you hear Malik finished a college-level test in under an hour? They gave him a real calculus problem yesterday, and he solved it. Callahan's freaking out. He crushed the whole test. The conference room had shifted to the principal's office, and inside, 3 copies of Malik's test sat before 3 adults. Ms. Carter flipped pages with growing pride. Principal Jacobs highlighted notes with a red pen, nodding occasionally. Mrs. Callahan, however, stared silently, her jaw tightening with every correct solution. "It's all correct," Jacob said, finally breaking the silence. "Not only that, but his explanations show real conceptual mastery." "He must have had help," Callahan muttered. "No student his age." A knock at the door interrupted her. "Come in," Jacobs called. The door opened, and in stepped a man in his late 50s, with a well-kept salt and pepper beard, wire-rimmed glasses, and the confident calm of someone who belonged in lecture halls. Malik's face lit up instantly. "Dr. Roberts," he said, standing instinctively. "Hello, Malik," the man said warmly. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I was told this was the time." Jacob stood. "You must be the university professor he mentioned?" "I am," he confirmed, shaking Jacob's hand. "James Roberts. I've been mentoring Malik privately for the past 6 months." Callahan stood too, her tone icy. "You expect us to believe a college professor has been privately teaching an 8th grader in secret?" "Not teaching," Roberts corrected calmly. "Mentoring. There's a difference. Malik doesn't need tutoring. He needs space to grow, and someone to remind him he's not crazy for seeing the world the way he does." He was handed a copy of the test and sat down to review it. After just a few pages, his expression softened into a proud smile. "This work," he said slowly, turning each page, "is not only accurate, it's elegant. His solution to problem 17? That's something I teach my second-year undergrads. I know Malik's handwriting. I know his method. This is his. No doubt in my mind." Callahan's voice was thinner now. "But that means I was wrong." "Yes," Jacob said. "It does." There was no malice in his voice, just fact. The fallout was swift. By the next school board meeting, the room was filled beyond capacity. Parents, students, staff, all there to witness a reckoning. Principal Jacobs presented his findings, Doctor. Robert spoke about Malik's gift, and Ms. Carter called for better systems to identify and support exceptional students. Then something no one expected happened. Zeke, the class clown, the loudest of the kids who once laughed at Malik, stepped up to the microphone. "I used to make fun of him," he admitted. "I thought it was funny when Ms. Callahan picked on him. But now I know it wasn't funny. It was cruel. And we all let it happen." His words rang out more loudly than any lecture, because they came from a kid who'd seen it up close. The school board moved fast. Callahan was placed on indefinite leave, pending investigation into physical misconduct. New district policies were enacted. 0 tolerance for teacher abuse, a gifted student identification plan, and an anonymous reporting system. Malik didn't celebrate publicly. He didn't want a trophy. He didn't want revenge. What he wanted was peace, and maybe a quiet spot in the library again, now that everyone knew. In the weeks that followed, he began attending math courses at the nearby high school. Dr. Roberts continued mentoring him. Ms. Carter became a guide in navigating the new attention. And Malik, for the first time, began helping other students, tutoring them after school in algebra and geometry, smiling when they had their own light bulb moments. One day, as he walked past what used to be Callahan's classroom, now taken over by a young, energetic teacher named Mr. Diaz, he paused. The room looked brighter. The windows were open. Kids were laughing, learning, asking questions without fear. That's when it hit him. Maybe the purpose of what he endured wasn't just to prove himself. Maybe it was to break something open. For everyone. Because sometimes a kid doesn't need to yell or fight to change the system. Sometimes all he has to do is let the numbers speak.